Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Mark Estigaribia here again, Managing Director from MSQ Ventures. We are honored to host Anders Manson, CEO of Oncoinvent, to our MSQ CEO Webinar Series. Anders brings nearly 30 years of international and diverse experience in oncology-focused drug development and commercialization. Today, we're excited to discuss cutting-edge therapeutics for the treatment of cancer, specifically learning more from Anders Manson from Oncoinvent's strategy, a clinical stage company advancing alpha emitter therapy to treat cancers. Oncoinvent is a clinical stage company developing innovative radiopharmaceutical therapy that selectively delivers alpha particle radiation to body cavity surfaces affected by the spread of cancer cells. Oncoinvent is advancing a pipeline of novel products that use alpha particles that eradicate cancer cells. Their lead candidate, Resferin, treats metastatic cancers in body cavities for the treatment and variety of other cancer indications as well. They're currently deployed in 2 ongoing clinical studies to treat PC from ovarian and colorectal cancer. Anders, how are you today?
Thank you. I'm doing quite well. How are you?
Good, good. Thank you. Thank you for participating at our CEO series. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Oslo, Norway, north of Europe.
Excellent. Well, MSQ is based in New York City. Our audience is global in nature, spanning 20 countries with a strong presence in China. Good evening, Shanghai. I guess where I wanted to start was, starting with your fascinating background, Anders, please share with us your historic pathway that led you to CEO of Oncoinvent.
Yeah, I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry basically all my adult life since university. I started in the early 90s. I worked most of my career in large multinational companies. I started in Meda once upon a time, then went to Faring Pharmaceuticals, and I've also worked for Leo Pharma, for example. In the last 6 or 7 years, I've worked in various biotech settings. I've worked as an investor myself on the board and also a CEO of a few companies. I've also worked on the investor side, advising a large private equity company on investments in the pharmaceutical and general healthcare sector. So I've been coming at this from different angles, but perhaps one very relevant and interesting thing in my career is that I used to head up global business development in Leo Pharma, which of course means that I was evaluating potential licensing opportunities and acquisitions from biotech. So I've been on the other side of the negotiation table, so to speak, and that's obviously a valuable experience in this case also.
Interesting. Working at business development in multinational companies like Leo and Faring, what are the main differences that we can learn from that you can share from your inspirational story?
Yeah, of course, it's a vastly different thing to work for a large multinational in comparison to working for a smaller biotech. We're 50 people here at Oncoinvent, so just organizationally, it's completely different. But I think the business development transaction per se that we all aspire to is, of course, the same. It's just coming at it from different perspectives. So I think it is of great value to have been on the other side of the negotiation table, as I said. I know what large pharmaceutical companies are looking for and what they don't want to see in opportunities approaching the market. Of course, in my current role, it is my duty to steer the company in that direction to advance things that large pharmaceutical companies are interested in seeing, and not to advance things that they are not interested in seeing. In general, I think, as a general rule of thumb, it's better to do things properly and to do fewer things than to try to do everything, but then perhaps not have the resources to do them properly. So that's how I manage Oncoinvent.
We've been experiencing a capital winter drought. We went through a biotech downturn, gone through a lot of M&A activities. We're seeing some green shoots in the biopharma globally. What are your outlooks for 2024?
Yeah, I think biotech is, of course, in a little bit of a slump right now because of the high interest levels and general risk aversity. But I think the segment that Oncoinvent is in, which is radiopharmaceuticals, is exactly the opposite, to be honest. I mean, we saw a big acquisition only a few weeks ago with Eli Lilly coming into radiopharmaceuticals. And we've also seen some very prominent capital raises, perhaps the most prominent one being Raise Bio, which had an IPO just some 6-7 weeks ago, which kicked up the valuation of that company to $1.4 billion US. And that's a company that is to some extent comparable to ours. So I think there is great big pharma interest in the radiopharmaceutical space. And because of that, there is also great investor interest in this space.
Excellent. I know you're probably going to go through this in your presentation of Resferin and also your assets, the pipeline, but just high level, what is the differentiation and the value prop of your lead asset at Oncoinvent?
Yeah, I mean, just summarizing, I'd say that it's a radiopharmaceutical. It uses alpha emission as its mode of action. And it is a local treatment. It is not a systemic treatment, which means that you don't have to send radioactive material through the bloodstream. It is, in that sense, very targeted, and the approach is applicable to body cavities. But of course, there's a lot of cancer that actually affect body cavities. If you include the peritoneum, which is our primary clinical objective, but also, for example, the pleura, the membrane around the lungs, which is also prone to metastases. So I think this body cavity treatment, this local body cavity treatment, without having to go through the bloodstream, is applicable to many different types of cancers.
Excellent. Looking at strategic alliances around the world, regional, global, again, just high level before we get in, dig in a little bit more. What are your goals for 2024 with regards to cross-border opportunities?
Yeah, so we will start phase 2B trials in Europe and the US. These trials will be for peritoneal metastases stemming from colorectal cancer and ovarian cancer. We will raise capital to make these trials move forward until the end of 2025, at which point we will be looking to either license or do some other kind of deal on Resferin, because at that point in time, we're likely to initiate a phase 3 trial, and a phase 3 trial in these indications, peritoneal metastases being sort of a bit of an orphan area. We need to have somebody on board who has commercial infrastructure to be ready to launch the product, because it's not at all unlikely that we will have a conditional approval in phase 3, given that the patients that we treat have essentially no other therapy to access. They've already tried chemotherapy and they have cytoreductive therapy, and our treatment essentially complements cytoreductive therapy.
Great. So I guess now we look forward to your knowledge sharing of Oncoinvent's novel approach to treat cancer. We'll take questions from the audience on the back of your presentation. Mr. Anders Manson, please share your screen and start your company discussion.
Thank you. I hope my screen is in presentation mode now.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I think it's best always to start with the key take-home messages, and then I'll repeat them at the end. And the presentation in between that will be just providing evidence for these points. So as I already alluded to, radiopharmaceuticals is quite the hotspot these days. This is stemming from the big pharma interest that we're seeing in this area. And of course, big pharma interest always sprouts also investor interest, and I'll show you a little bit later on. We have solid competency in Oncoinvent. It's one of the reasons why I was attracted to Oncoinvent in the first place. Our founder and also key personnel working at Oncoinvent were also the founders and key developers behind Xofigo, which was the first alpha emitter on the market currently with Bayer. So we have solid experience in developing a radiopharmaceutical therapy and taking it all the way to the market in our company. Then I'll show you that peritoneal carcinomatosis or peritoneal metastases is an area of very high unmet medical need. These patients have a very poor prognosis and they've got nowhere else to turn. Essentially, all of these patients that we're treating have already tried chemotherapy with meager results. So this is essentially a product that can become standard therapy. It is a pipeline in a product because there are many different types of cancer that seed metastases in body cavities. The peritoneal cavity that we focus on first clinically is a cavity that is prone to metastasis from very many different types of cancer stemming from the gastrointestinal tract, but also the reproductive tract. So you can essentially go from indication to indication with the same type of product. And yes, as I already alluded to, standard of care status is attainable for us if we have the results that we currently have from phase 2A, also when we get to phase 2B and phase 3, of course. Okay, so starting to prove the points that I've made here. So radiopharmaceuticals is an investment hotspot in oncology. We saw that not in the least in the beginning of the last month with Lilly making an inroads into radiopharmaceuticals by the acquisition of Point Biopharma, another radiopharmaceutical company. And in the upper left-hand corner, you can see also what I also alluded to before. Raise Bio had an IPO only 1.5 months ago, almost 2 months ago now, which was quite spectacular in terms of the valuation of the company. And we can see the capital raises for other companies just in the last few months has also been quite successful. So there is great interest in the area. Last week, I visited Bio Europe, and I can tell you that it's a pleasure to be representing a radiopharmaceutical company in comparison to many other segments of oncology these days. As I also alluded to, we have a solid foundation in Oncoinvent. Again, we have lots of experienced people. We have people who were instrumental in developing Xofigo in the past and bringing it to market. And we do have quite a competence cluster in radiopharmaceuticals here in Oslo, Norway. We do have that kind of expertise. We have also chosen, I think, made a very clever choice in terms of our radioactive source and radioisotope. It's radium-224, which is derived from thorium-228, whereas a lot of other companies are using actinium. This, of course, means that we have ample supply of our radioisotope, which is very important as radiopharmaceuticals is getting increasingly competitive also from a sourcing perspective. And we do have our own GMP manufacturing and clinical operations, of course, here in Oslo. It's important to control production here. We have in-house production currently, but we will expand our manufacturing capability by doing a tech transfer to another site in Europe in 2024 and to a US site in 2025. Okay, so this is the first slide on peritoneal carcinomatosis. So if you take a view at cancer and the peritoneum in general, you will find that it could potentially be primary, but that's very rare and that's not a condition that we can treat. It can also be secondary from the outside, and that's also a category of cancers that we don't treat. So we treat peritoneal cancers or peritoneal metastases coming from the organs inside the peritoneum. And again, generally, it's the gastrointestinal tract organs and reproductive tract organs. And we have chosen to prioritize 2 clinically, one from the gastrointestinal tract, that's colorectal cancer, and one from the reproductive tract, and that's ovarian cancer. And the percentages you see to the right there is the propensity to seed metastasis in the peritoneum, which you can see is quite significant here. So this is an area that has a vast unmet medical need, but also significant patient numbers, and I'll quantify that in a bit. So how is this used? Well, as I made a point of earlier, it's not used in a systemic way. It's used as an adjuvant therapy to cytoreductive surgery, which means that the surgeon opens up the peritoneum, removes all the macroscopic, the visible metastases surgically. But as we are all too acutely aware, once you do that, you are almost sure to have a slew of micrometastases left behind that you cannot see, and therefore you cannot remove surgically. And this is what our treatment is all about, to complement surgery by instilling in the peritoneum 1 billion or more than 1 billion of microparticles with radium-224 to radiate all of the inside of the peritoneum with alpha radiation. And the key things about alpha radiation is that they are energy intense, so they tend to be quite effective in eradicating cells, but alpha radiation doesn't have a long range in tissue. It is only 0.1 millimeter, which I will show you in the next slide. And that means that you don't reach into healthy tissue, but you will radiate the entire inner lining of the peritoneum where these micrometastases might have seeded themselves. So alpha radiation, which we use, is very effective, especially if you want to treat a large area, as we want to, a large inner area of the peritoneum. But we don't want the radiation to reach deep into the actual tissue, and certainly not to other organs. And this is what we also see in our safety data. So we've done clinical development phase 1/2A. We've done that at these in these two indications. So ovarian cancer, peritoneal metastasis stemming from ovarian cancer, and peritoneal metastasis stemming from colorectal carcinoma. And these clinics have been involved. So it's Oslo, it's Leuven in Belgium, it's Madrid in Spain, and it's Oslo and Uppsala for the colorectal cancer study. And this next slide is essentially just giving an overview of our very robust safety profile. So as is highlighted in the first point here, we saw only grade 1 to 2 events reported as related to Radspherin, which is really nothing, especially in this setting where the patient is quite ill and has just undergone major surgery. So this is a very good clean bill of health, so to speak. We didn't have any dose-limiting toxicity whatsoever, so we were able to choose the most highly efficacious dose, which is 7 megabecquerel. And I want to highlight also that we use single dosing. You can do repeat dosing if you want to, but that's not part of the dosing scheme. So the objective is simply to treat once a few days after the surgery, eradicate the micrometastases that the surgeon couldn't see and therefore could not remove, and thus prolong the life expectancy of the patient. We have measured the absorbed doses in other organs, but as I already alluded to in the previous slide, alpha radiation is very short range in tissue, so we didn't see any doses that were associated with toxicity. And because this is alpha radiation, it's essentially stopped very easily by a single sheet of paper. There are no special precautions as regards the healthcare personnel treating the patient or relatives to the patient. They can be in the same room. There's no restrictions whatsoever there. So from a safety perspective, this is a very practical and safe treatment. And then the question becomes, how efficacious is it? And this is alluded to in this slide. So we didn't have a randomized control study in phase 1/2A, of course, but we have a historic comparison group. This is in colorectal cancer. These would be patients undergoing cytoreductive surgery in combination with HIPEC, which is high temperature chemotherapy. So we know very well that these patients, after going through this kind of therapy, have a progression-free survival of slightly less than 12 months. So when we look at the 15-month data in the colorectal cancer study, we saw that only 25% of patients had a recurrence. And if we look specifically at peritoneal recurrences, they had 0 peritoneal recurrences. And only a few weeks ago, we also presented data on 18 months, which is the full follow-up of this study. And we saw 33% total recurrences, and again, no peritoneal recurrences at all. And this is really important to distinguish between, because it could be the case that these patients at the time of surgery actually had distant metastases when surgery commenced, if it could have been detected. And we know that imaging technology is improving essentially by the day, and that new diagnostic therapy or diagnostic standards are being adopted. So we think that once we get to phase 3, there will be further imaging technology available as standard diagnoses, which means that you can screen those patients even better than today. The organ that we treat is the peritoneum. If the patient has already got distant metastases, we can't do anything about that. So with increased specificity in screening, we will be able to increase our essential efficacy even further than this. So this is much better than expected. We didn't expect to have a result whereby we didn't have any recurrences at all after 18 months. It's simply spectacular. So on the basis of this, we will advance to phase 2B, and we will do that study or these studies both in Europe and the US, and we will continue with ovarian cancer and colorectal cancer. And you can see the inclusion criteria here. And if you look at the entire target population, given the inclusion criteria that we apply, in the US and Europe, there are about 4,000 of these patients per year. And in colorectal cancer, there would be about 20,000 patients per year. So this is using the relatively narrow inclusion criteria that we've got for the phase 2B in order to, as quickly as possible, tease out the effect. But we are considering expanding from that inclusion criteria. If you look at the phase 3, we will go with the same for colorectal cancer, which we think will be done through a phase 2B/3 study. So essentially the phase 2B study that we're about to start in the spring of next year will probably be simply extended to include more patients, and then it will be a phase 2B/3. For the ovarian cancer, we might change the inclusion criteria somewhat and broaden the inclusion criteria, and then we get to a patient population of about 8,000. But you can envision this expanding further as the product draws towards commercialization. If we only target the high-risk patients and don't require that they have visible metastases in the peritoneum, in the colorectal space, that would be 90,000 patients per year. If we take essentially all comers in terms of ovarian cancer and don't really care about whether they're HRD positive or negative, primary or secondary, that would be almost 30,000 patients. Then, of course, as we already saw in one of the previous slides, there are other cancer forms than colorectal cancer and ovarian cancer that seed metastases in the peritoneum. If you go, for example, to the gastric cancer segment, which is a segment which is very pertinent, especially in Asia, there will be in the US and Europe alone about 25,000 patients, but many, many more patients in Asia for that indication. And then, of course, we can expand further from there. We could go further into other cancer indications in the peritoneum, or we could go to other body cavities. And the body cavity that we have in mind to expand further into first would be the pleura, the membrane around the lungs, which is also very susceptible to metastases. So there is essentially, as I said, a pipeline in a product here. So in terms of pricing, just to put together some sort of a back of the envelope business case, here we look at the other available radiopharmaceutical products that are already on the market. We already talked about Xofigo, which was developed and originally founded by key personnel here at Oncoinvent. That is in prostate cancer. This is $69,000 US per treatment. Lutathera, $190,000. Pluvicto, $250,000 US per treatment. We also aspire to have a progression-free survival, which actually surpasses these. But we have, so far at least, for the back of the envelope calculation, considered a price which is lower than all of this, namely $50,000 US. So putting together a bit of a business case, as I alluded to, just taking the narrow inclusion criteria that we've got for the phase 2B trial and not counting on any expansion of those inclusion criteria. We have 24,000 patients in the EU and the US alone. We count on a peak penetration, assuming we get standard of care at 70%. It's not a market share. There is no market. So 70% of the patients that already go through cytoreductive surgery would also have our precautionary treatment, which is very likely to prolong progression-free survival. And then the average pricing, as I said, $50,000, which is lower than the other radiopharmaceuticals. And then we simply added 20% of sales outside of the US and Europe. And this could essentially be much more, actually. But doing that calculation with the narrow inclusion criteria, it's got a sales potential of about $1 billion. And again, we are absolutely sure that if we get to market with colorectal cancer and ovarian cancer and peritoneal metastases, it is likely to have uptake also in peritoneal metastases caused by other cancers. Okay, so the next slide essentially just shows you what I already alluded to, that there is a very poor prognosis, a very high unmet medical need, a large room for improvement in terms of prognosis for these patients. And this, as you see at the bottom of the slide, is especially pertinent for gastric cancer, whereby the progression-free survival is much less than a year, and where there is absolutely no survival at 5 years. So these are patients that are really in a great medical need here. This is a bit of a busy slide, but this is a slide that talks to our plans going forward. So currently we are, of course, at the end of 2023. This week we recruit our final patient for the phase 2A. And then these patients will be followed up for 18 months as regards colorectal cancer and 24 months as regards ovarian cancer. Those are the triangles in the top left corner. We have already applied for an IND to do studies also in the US for the phase 2B, and we have already been granted the INDs. That actually happened only just last week. We will also apply for fast track designations, and the plan is to start the trials in the second quarter of next year. So then the full recruitment of those studies is deemed to happen by the end of 2025. And that is, of course, also when the full follow-up period, the full 24 follow-up period of the ovarian cancer phase 2A study and the full follow-up period of the colorectal cancer phase 2A study, which is only 18 months, will be available. So at the end of 2025, we will have recruited and treated all the patients in the phase 2B, and we will have also the full follow-up data from the phase 2A trial. So with that data set in hand, we will go to the authorities, the FDA and EMA, and ask if we can simply continue the phase 2B trial, especially in colorectal cancer, to make it a phase 2B/3 trial. For ovarian cancer, we might do the same, or we might expand the inclusion criteria a bit, in which case it will be a separate phase 3 trial. And at that time, the end of 2025, when we have this dialogue with the authorities and hopefully get an approval to initiate phase 3, that is a point in time at which we really want to have a commercial partner on board. We could probably refinance to do the phase 3 study ourselves, but we don't think it's the best option to try to become a global pharmaceutical company in a haste. And this is crucial because we do think that during the course of the phase 3, at least if the results are echoed in comparison to what we see today, that we will have a conditional approval sometime during the course of the phase 3 trial. So our objective is to have a partner on board which has the commercial infrastructure and the capabilities to launch a radiopharmaceutical in some sort of a license agreement or other type of agreement by the end of 2025. In order to do this, we must tap the financial markets. We need about $50 million to get to essentially mid-2026, so passing this value inflection point, and have the full commitment to the phase 2B studies. And again, it should be observed in this slide that we don't currently have any plans for Asia. So if anybody is interested in Asia, I would welcome that type of a contact. At the bottom of the slide, you also see that we are increasing our production capacity. We have production capacity to supply for the clinical studies, but we will gradually build up supply capacity so that by the time we're in phase 3, we will have commercial supply capabilities. So what kinds of partners are ideal to do this on a global scale or a US and European scale? Well, at the right of the slide, you see large pharmaceutical companies already active in radiopharmaceuticals, but not in colorectal cancer and ovarian cancer. To the left, you see pharmaceutical companies involved in colorectal cancer and ovarian cancer, but not in radiopharmaceuticals. And in the middle there is a bit of a sweet spot with large pharmaceutical companies who are active both in the radiopharmaceutical space and particularly in our indications as well. And as we already saw in one of the previous slides, only a few weeks ago, we saw Lilly move into this space as well. So that space in the middle there is essentially our sweet spot, but we're happy to consider other options as well, of course. So this takes us back to the take-home messages. So again, radiopharmaceuticals is quite the hotspot, both in terms of big pharma interest and investor interest. We have a solid competency in this company, as many, many people in Oncoinvent has done this before in the development of Xofigo, which was the first alpha emitter on the market. Perhaps we will have the second in Oncoinvent. Peritoneal carcinomatosis or peritoneal metastases is an area of very high unmet medical need. As you saw the prognosis charts, these patients have a very poor prognosis indeed, and there are quite a lot of these patients. And I'm talking only about the peritoneal metastases patients in this case, but of course, expanding to other body cavities will expand the target group even further. Radspherin is a pipeline in products essentially because you can go from indication from cancer type to cancer type just inside the peritoneum, but moving also outside of the peritoneum, for example, to the pleura, will open up for even further patient groups. And we do think that standard of care is attainable here. Currently, we have quite impressive results, I'll say, better than we even expected in terms of the local recurrences. And if that persists in terms of phase 2b and phase 3 results, I have no doubt that this will become standard of care for these patients. And as I've showed you, this is something that has blockbuster potential. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity to take questions.
Great. Thank you, Anders. Really appreciate that knowledge share of Oncoinvent and your pipeline. Congratulations on all your achievements to date. Looking forward to furthering the pipeline for this therapy to treat cancer. Let me just, while we get the questions, I guess, one of the questions that you're thinking about, so you're currently working on a $50 million raise. Can you elaborate just a little bit more in terms of when you started the process, when you expect to get that funding done, and what are the use of proceeds?
Yeah, so we expect to get the funding done through 2024. It will probably be tiered, so we will have a first cash injection in Q1. This is probably going to be largely a local affair. We're based in Norway. We have a very strong shareholder base in Norway. So I think the first tier to get the study started will be mainly existing investors, but also other local investors here. But we certainly aspire to attract the interest of major venture capital and funds. So I think that is going to come during the course of 2024. We have some dialogues ongoing. We have funds in due diligence at the moment. And we'll see after that if we need further cash injections beyond that. We could potentially IPO in 2024. We're certainly keeping that option open. There is such a great interest in radiopharmaceuticals right now, so it might be an option to explore.
Excellent. You did share a slide with regards to potential partners that you'd be interested in from the regional perspective and also commercialization perspective. On the way to commercialization partner, what are the characteristics you're looking for in a regional partner, whether that's US, Europe, or other regions around the world, China, for example?
Yeah, I don't think that we would go for a regional partner in Europe and the US. I think those will go together. But we could be going for a regional partner as regards Asia. I mean, right now we don't have any development plans for Asia, so it would have to be a company that would be competent in developing the product from its current state. It would also be of benefit if that company could have local production or regional production for Asia. because let's remember that this is a drug that has a shelf life, well, it will be extended from 5 days to 8 days, but it needs to be shipped essentially for every single patient. And currently we can easily ship to anywhere in the US and still manage with the shelf life that we have. But I think it will be increasingly difficult to do also for Asia. So it will be of benefit to have a production site in Asia, and if a partner that could run such a site would be a preferred partner.
Great. So this is one question. So as radiopharmaceuticals continue to gain investor and big pharma focus, what are the specific factors that make this field particularly attractive for companies to collaborate with Oncoinvent? I guess also speak to the popularity of radiopharmaceuticals at this moment in time.
Yeah, if we start with the segment at large, I think it's a bit of a rebirth of an oncology segment, which is the reason why there is such a great interest. Of course, radiopharmaceuticals tend to be very efficacious, and they don't seem to be susceptible to the kind of resistance that we see being developed in cancer cells against different kinds of cancer therapy. This is radiopharmaceuticals is essentially applying quite a blunt approach. These alpha particles, they physically destroy the DNA helix in the cells. I mean, it's not something that a cell can grow resistant to. It's quite a blunt instrument. So effectiveness is I think the key to the attractiveness here. So effectiveness is not really the problem. The problem then it becomes that of targeting, which is why radiopharmaceuticals tend to use different targeting methodologies. Of course, if you need to shoot your drug through the bloodstream, if you don't have a specific organ to treat, then you need to have some sort of an aggregate that has a certain affinity to a specific type of cell. Of course, you still have to shoot it through the bloodstream, so there is some exposure to healthy tissue as well. Our approach is in a sense a simple approach, but quite elegant. So we treat only cancer in body cavities, and thereby we don't have to shoot any radioactive material through the bloodstream. Therefore, there is no exposure to anything outside of the body cavity that we treat. And that is simply another, in a way, simple, but also elegant way of doing the targeting.
Great, thank you. There's a question here about your team. If you can just elaborate on the Oncoinvent's management team, science team, in terms of their contributions to the overall goal at Oncoinvent.
Yeah, so our founder, who's also our chairman, is Roy Larson, who was the inventor behind Xofigo. So I think that speaks volumes to the experience. And of course, he has also recruited quite a team around him, which were the same people who were instrumental in bringing Xofigo through development phases and eventually to the market. So we have a lot of these people in Oncoinvent too. So that I think is reassuring as regards our competence in this area. That is so important because there is such a lack of people, of course, since radiopharmaceutical is quite a novel area that has competency and experience in this field. So this is something that's really good. Also, the vicinity, the proximity around us here in Oslo, there is a lot of companies that have radiopharmaceutical or other types of radiation therapy experience in this area. So it's a bit of a cluster in this arena here in Oslo, Norway. Otherwise, in terms of management, yes, as I already alluded to, a lot of people in senior positions come from Algeta, which was the company that was behind Xofigo.
Great. With regards to collaborating opportunities with Oncoinvent, you mentioned that you're open to Asian partners. So what type of deal structures are you considering when working with other regional partners on your way to commercialization?
Yeah, I mean, a regional partner, I think, would have to come with a significant capability in doing this and realizing what radiopharmaceuticals is all about. So I think, again, technical competency and the availability of a suitable production site in Asia would be instrumental to our desire to do a deal. And of course, we would require some sort of payment for the license per se, and we would certainly be ready to do the tech transfer, etc. We would also view it positively if they were to invest in equity in the company. That could be a part of raising the $50 million US. So yeah, those are essentially our thoughts on this matter. We haven't actively pursued a partner as yet for Asia. We have focused very much on Asia and Europe, but I think the market is really, really interesting in Asia too. I realize it might not be the same percentage point of patients that will be able to get reimbursement for these kinds of therapies, which by nature are very expensive to produce and therefore cannot be very, very inexpensive. But we do think that the Asian market has a large number of these patients anyway, and the reimbursement systems or insurance systems set up for these patients. And there are certainly a lot of these patients in Asia that suffer from these cancers and have the peritoneal metastases. So I think there is a good basis for suggesting that thinking about developing the product also for Asia is a wise move.
Great, thank you. Excuse me. What steps have you taken to protect the IP associated with Resferin globally and regionally, maybe?
Yeah, we have IP in all major markets and also very many minor markets all around the world. And I can't go into exactly details here, but we feel very well protected. Also, I'd like to say that this radiopharmaceutical area as such is not really an area for copycats. It's very cumbersome, very well, you need a certain set of skills to produce these pharmaceuticals. So it's not really a generic game at all. So protection is actually the least of my worries.
It's been a tough capital raising environment. What gives you the confidence? Have you already received initial interest on your current round? Any I guess advice you can give to other biopharma companies looking to raise capital in this environment?
It is tough to raise capital in general in biotech or biopharma these days. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But again, as I showed in the slides, in radiopharmaceuticals, or in that segment in particular, it doesn't seem to be the case. We also have had a lot of initial interest. I mean, I just came back from BioEurope last week. There is a lot of interest in this space. So we're very lucky to be in this space. And we feel confident that we will be able to attract the $50 million US needed to get to the value inflection point. It could also be that we don't only take this from the financial markets. I mean, we're open to doing some sort of an industry deal. It could be like an option deal, and that could be then part of the financing, or an equity deal with an industry player. That could also be a part of it. Yeah, so we're flexible in terms of how the money comes in. And another factor for us is that we have a very, very strong ownership base currently, but we would very much like to expand it because currently it's very sort of Scandinavian based, and it would be a benefit to have international owners as well, especially on the US side.
Great. There is a question here. How do you envision the adoption of Resferin in clinical practice and its integration in existing treatment guidelines?
It's a very short and easy answer to that. If we have results that resemble the results that we have currently from the phase 2A, once we're in a position to get to market, whether that's from the phase 2B or phase 3 trial, I mean, then this will become standard therapy as an adjuvant therapy to surgery. No doubt in my mind about that. So it's all in the clinical data. There is no competition. There is nobody else doing this. There's nobody else developing a drug, at least not clinically, for peritoneal metastases. So it's not a question of market share. It's just a question of adaptation and adoption.
Excellent. I guess I know you mentioned this in your presentation, kind of spoke about it, but maybe just to summarize it for in a couple of bullet points. But in the field of radiopharmas, what sets Resfennon apart from other therapies or competitors in terms of its unique features or advantages?
Yeah, it's set apart because we're using a different methodology of targeting. The typical way to do it is to connect it to something that attaches itself to a receptor at the cell that you wish to target. So the targeting is done on the cellular level, but you still have to shoot the drug through the bloodstream, which inevitably exposes the entire body essentially to some degree of radiation. We have a different approach. We treat only body cavities. And by treating only body cavities, we instill in these body cavities microparticles that cannot escape the body cavity, so they can never go systemic. So we keep them in the body cavity, and they do the radiation that affects the micrometastases that are left behind after surgery. So it's a completely different approach to most other radiopharmaceuticals.
Great. Excellent. Well, I think that concludes our webinar knowledge sharing series with Oncoinvent. Thank you, Anders, for your contribution. Any last words for the audience?
No, I think this is an interesting segment, a segment of high interest globally. I think the Asian market is an interesting one, which has perhaps been under-considered so far in the company. So I would welcome any approaches from your clients. And yeah, I'm hoping to bring a new therapy to the market, which is badly needed, especially for these patients.
Well, thank you very much for participating at the MSQ Webinar Series. We're looking forward to JP Morgan. We're going to have an event on the 7th. Want to welcome everyone to the event. And of course, we will invite Oncoinvent to present and participate. So looking forward to great things from you, Anders. Looking forward to 2024. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you so much.